Welcome to the Sorensen Center's first virtual Critical Voices from Local to Global series. This is our first event of the fall semester, and we are delighted to kick off with Maina Kiai and to have such a terrific turnout. Thank you, Maina, and thank you all for joining. I'm Camille Massey, Founding Executive Director of the Sorensen Center, and Maina is a non-resident scholar at the Sorensen Center. Of course, we're all non-resident now, but Maina was in residence last year in 2019, and we often gathered around our table in the Sorensen Center and in conference rooms, and we had these intense, intellectually challenging conversations with Maina about community building, about international human rights, and also about the increasing effect of authoritarian regimes. And we really benefited from Maina's deep experience as the first ever United Nations Special Rapporteur for freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and also his knowledge from his home country in Kenya. So today we gather around this virtual table and we welcome new students and returning students, alums. We have many friends of the Sorensen Center. We have many Sorensen Center fellows. It's so good to see, I'm looking through the list now, we have local partners joining us from CUNY and SUNY campuses, John Jay, we have Hunter, Queens College, City College, Colin Powell School, we have SUNY Stony Brook, and also in New York we have the Open Society, Global Kids, Breakthrough, Outright, Brooklyn Defenders, BDS, Safe Horizon, Paul Weiss. We could go on, and it's not just in New York. We have from across the country. I see Williams Institute from UCLA, and even friends from East Africa, from UHI, joining us. So this is quite a good start and a tribute to Maina with all of this interest. A warm welcome to all of you. We hope you will continue to stay involved with the Sorensen Center and that you will participate fully in today's discussion. So I can't resist a few additional shout outs. We have Gillian Sorensen, Ted Sorensen's widow, who has had a distinguished career at the United Nations and is very involved with the International Rescue Committee and the Sorensen Center. Steve Rosenfeld, who was Ted Sorensen's law partner at Paul Weiss and was very instrumental in connecting Ted's legacy to CUNY Law. We have Marge Hornblower, Ted's longtime assistant. And Gillian, you serve as the Sorensen Center's advisory honorary chair. Would you like to say a few words before we start?
Unmute, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, Camille, and hello to everyone. It is so good to be part of this, to have students and scholars and friends and supporters from all over. This is a different year, to be sure, and unusual to gather in this way, but I'm very happy that we're doing it. And I especially want to give my respects, my salute to Maina Kiai, for all he has done, the most distinguished lawyer, defender of human rights, working in his home country, working with the United Nations, working with Human Rights Watch. We are so grateful for your participation last year and look forward very much to our conversation today. So thank you, Camille, for your extraordinary leadership as well. And I look forward to listening and learning in the next hour and to meeting many of the students as this year goes forward. Thanks again.
Wonderful, Gillian. And I also see we have another distinguished advisor who has joined us as well. We have Jennifer Dorn, who is a nursing professor and head of global initiatives and has guided us quite a bit at Columbia University. And she is also the widow of Haywood Burns, who was a remarkable second dean of CUNY School of Law. And I see Matt Glover. I'd love to get a fellow's voice in here, who was a Sorensen Fellow last year, and he spent his fellowship in Brazil looking at race and education. And Matt is a recent graduate and was recently selected for a Fulbright scholarship. Congratulations, Matt.
Thank you, Camille. Happy to be here, obviously. I was just doing a little bit of studying for the accursed bar exam. It's not been fun, but it's going to be over soon, I hope. Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously happy to be here. I took time out of studying to be here. So I think that shows at least somewhat my level of interest in Sorensen. I love Sorensen. I'm so grateful to have had the chance to go to Brazil last year. It was last year, yeah, to do a lot of study, a lot of learning. I think everybody, for the people who are 1Ls in the Zoom right now, apply for Sorensen. It's a great opportunity. It gets you out of the United States, and it gets you in proximity to points of view that aren't sort of, I mean, I'm just going to say it, like sort of tainted by how the United States operates. I think it's really important and really special to be able to convene with people outside of this country, outside of this frame of mind. And that's also why a talk like this today with Maina is so cool. I had the opportunity to be in a couple of those last year and the year before, actually, and they were really, really informative for me. And so I hope everybody enjoys today. I'm going to enjoy it, I'm sure. And like I said, if you apply for Sorensen, Camille will work with you. And if you get it, it's an amazing opportunity. So just happy to be here.
Thank you, Matt. We're happy to have you here. Thanks for taking your study break with us. So with protests happening around the country and across the globe, this is a moment to really look at the right of peaceful assembly. And there was a new general comment, only the 37th comment in the history of the Human Rights Committee since the 1970s, that was recently on peaceful assembly. And I think this is the moment to turn it over to someone who has really worked on making that happen, and has also worked in his own country, but around the world, in the US. He was in Ferguson. He was giving the report as the UN Special Rapporteur. And he came back to us, and he's, as I say, a scholar forever. So Maina, welcome.
Thank you very much, Camille, and good to see you again. And Peter, since although you have disappeared from my screen, but it's really good to see you guys all again. It's just great. I mean, it's you once you get influenced by the Sorensen Center, you really don't leave. And if you leave, you're going to be dragging and screaming and leave your scratch marks on the driveway. Everybody can see you being dragged off, because it's just such a fulfilling, wonderful experience, and I just loved it. I mean, and I've been into a number of universities in the U.S., a number of law schools, and really my heart is with CUNY and Sorensen Center. And as I tell Camille, when you all are ready to expand and open up a center in Washington or somewhere else, hey, I'm your guy. I'll happily try and do what I can do. It's just a great phenomenon. And I really do like the fact that it's aimed at public service. It's aimed at a segment of people who are not the usual suspects, and I think that's really what is happening in the world today. Is that there's a whole move to move away from the usual suspects, and it's interesting, even as we're looking at the protests today in the U.S. and we're looking at everything else. A great part of it is about marginalization. It's about status quo. It's about a global elite that has forgotten everybody else, a national elite. And people standing up. And I think that's going to happen continuously for a long time. It's just fascinating to see, even as you go through this election process in the US, that there is people talking about inequalities, about healthcare as a right, even though there's resistance from the political elite, because from where I stand, US is an outlier. I think it's the only country that only economically advanced country that has a problem with the idea of healthcare as a right. I mean, and when you start doing that, they start saying you're socialist. And I look and think, you know, it's a right in Switzerland. It's a right in Germany. It's a right, and being a right meaning if you can't afford, you're still going to be treated and treated well. Only in the U.S., it's a right in Canada. Only in the U.S. can you come and say, sorry, unless you have a job or you have this expensive health insurance, you're on your own. You just die off. Public health care is rubbish, not very good, and you'll be on your own. So it's part of those things I think that are being contested. And I think it's a good contestation, which comes in then now with issues of racism and following the events over the summer and just seeing how the energy of young people, it just was been lovely to see. I mean, I went to a lot of the protests, I must say, in DC, and I was socially distancing because I have to. So I wasn't right in the middle of them. But people of my generation, I want to be as far away as possible from these young people who are very strong and loud and in the mix of it. But it was just so inspirational to see how multiracial it was, how determined people were. Things that I had never, ever thought I would see in the U.S. Some of the placards were just fascinating. And the one that I still in my head is the one people saying, you know, white silence equals violence. And that's being pushed by white people. That was amazing to see, you know. It just means there's a turnaround, there's a pushback, and there's a turn in this country which may or may not succeed depending on what happens in November and whether you guys decide you're going to mail in your ballot, so you're going to line up and wait until your ballot is cast and counted. Otherwise, you might have difficulty. So it's just fascinating. I mean, the tools that we have, and I think the thing about freedom of assembly is that it is really one of the most powerful tools we have as human beings that say what we feel and show what we feel, and the consistency of it almost always brings up some change. It's not always easy. There's always going to be pushback. There's going to be attacks, as we saw. And the fact is, there is going to be. I mean, look, it's people who would come out to the protest and get really angry because your president decides that he's going to tear gas people so he can take a walk and be pictured outside a church with a Bible. You know, that's the only reason people are tear gas. Not because no threat, nothing else, but because he wants a photo op. So it's amazing how that angers people because it is a tool we have, and it's a tool we should use and use carefully though, and use judiciously, but be persistent about it. It doesn't happen overnight. Won't happen overnight. We're seeing what, you know, even after all that, we're seeing what's happening on in Wisconsin. And I was talking to some friends the other day. I'm thinking, you know, what is it about policing that police will still shoot even after a summer like happened in the U.S., that they'll still shoot somebody in the back. Yes, maybe he wasn't obeying orders to stop, but shooting them is not the way you deal with it. And just something that is weird. And so hopefully as we go on, there will be questions and people are going to interrogate how policing is done, not just in the U.S., but really across the world. And how do you do that in a way that really celebrates humanity and the freedom of assembly and association. Camille talked about the general comment. I think that's, and for those of you who may not know, the UN has what we call a Human Rights Committee. And the Human Rights Committee's job is to take the articles of what's written in the international law, in this case, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and put meat into it, explain it, expound it, so that it makes sense beyond just the words. So it's not a court. So it's basically it functions you'd say like a court, because it interprets what the provisions of law are, and then what those things are called is general comment, and they're important. They are not binding law, but they're very strong, persuasive law in terms of making people understand what it was. So this was the first time to do freedom of assembly. We have been waiting for years and years, and we've been pushing and pushing. The early years of the Human Rights Committee were devoted to freedom of expression, and I think that's partly because I think the Americans were pushing that so strongly and trying, in a sense, to make international law conform to American law, because they are different in terms of restrictions. Article 20, Americans do not accept Article 20 of the ICCPR, but the rest of the world does. So that's part of the things that were going on there. But this was big. You know, we've been pushing them to move on freedom of assembly and association. I think there are no major surprises. I think I'm happy to say, of course, a lot of the work that I did as a rapporteur was embedded in the general comment. The one part I think that was important for me is, and that's one of the hardest parts, was was an acknowledgement, the general comment, that the right of assembly entails providing people who want to assemble with all the other rights and all the other facilities that they can be able to assemble, including the right to resources. So this was a big one for us, because states, governments and authorities across the world have been using resources as a tool to stop civil society and people from organizing, from coming together. So it starts off always as we don't need foreign funding, and then it says, okay, your funding is going to be restricted. You must not only account, but you must get permission to receive money. Every single cent must be reported to the authorities. And they treat civil society very differently from the way they treat businesses. So part of the push is saying, look, why should you treat civil society differently from business? They are also receiving money. So as we do that, so this was a big push to say that civil society has a right to receive resources, and that is broad enough to include foreign, international, national resources. Now, of course, that can be misused. Like everything else, law can be misused, provisions can be misused, and that's part of the role that we play is to make sure that we focus on the right, with the exceptions being the afterthought. So, and I've just been in a discussion this morning about something else, and there was a big debate about freedom of expression and whether we should be restricting first and then giving opt-outs, or we should first open and then give opt-ins, or whatever it is in that way. So in human rights, the sense is that you have your right is the paramount thing. The default position is that you have a right, and then if there are any restrictions, they come after. So the default position is always in favor of you exercising your right. That's an important phraseology. So it is that you have the right, and then you can have exemptions or restrictions if the test, what we call the tripartite test, is done. And you'll probably learn this if you haven't done that in your law class. But it's an important part of the thinking around these things. The second thing is that right to assembly is not a privilege. You do not need permission to exercise any right. And I think that's important. You see, in many countries, and that cuts across many places, and this includes the US, they make it mandatory that for you to seek permission from the authorities, often the police, to exercise your right. In the US, that is the law. You must get permission from the police. The US, though, I gotta say, does not often say no. But even the whole idea, and you know what kind of president you've got now. The whole idea of, if it's easy to misuse a provision like that, because you may want to protest and the police say no, because they can, really, they have the legal power. And as we're seeing in this regime in the US, those loopholes can be abused very, very significantly. So I think this time for people start thinking about making that right into a right. So you don't give leaders and authorities the chance to play around with them and say, it is the law. There's no law that prohibits us to do that. We can give our convention speech from the White House. We can do all these things from where we work, because there's no law prohibiting it. So we need to start tightening the laws, and because the US especially operates very much on the basis of trust and culture and tradition. And I think what we are seeing the last 4 years is that this doesn't mean anything to some people, and it can be abused. So we've got to go through this, and as you're thinking about, and of course, then the next thing, I think for me, the freedom of assembly is also very much linked to the right to vote, which is why people often begin to protest or get angry when they're right. Either most protests are about police brutality, or their right to vote not being abused, not being respected. So those are major concerns that keep sustained protests. So you have an election in a few months, guys, and I hope you all are going out to vote. I hope you're all going out to register people. I think it's more important. Again, for me, this is one of the strangest places that I've seen, because the US is an outlier in being the only country I know that actively discourages people from voting. No other country, bar none. Democracy is about people coming in. There's no country that has as many restrictions on voting than this one. And I think this is, whether it is the laws that don't allow people who have been convicted of crime to vote, or whether it's making sure there's gerrymandering, they're moving the stations from here to there, mail the postal ballots, whatever it is. There's no country that that makes your right so hard to exercise. And that's kind of interesting in its own place. And I think it's something that I hope with time the US will be able to start addressing to make this right really absolute. The fact that somebody has smoked cocaine and has been caught smoking cocaine, whatever they do with cocaine, this not cocaine, should not mean their right to vote is taken away. It's got nothing to do with it. And so this idea that the punishment must continue to remove your right to vote, therefore you're not a full citizen because you committed a crime, is incredibly strange. It's incredibly strange. Look at it from a global perspective, even from a human rights perspective. It's the strangest thing that happens. So I think, look, there's a lot of going on. There's a lot of hope, but hope doesn't come by itself. It comes up because people work at it. People put their time in. They put the energy in. They organize. They work at it. They keep at it, and sometimes there's consequences, and it might happen. And as you're seeing in Wisconsin, some people are beginning to shoot, and we hope that to shoot at the protesters. It's not great. In fact, it's very scary, very, very scary. But the best response I've seen across the world is that when there's that much fear, the best response is to come out in larger numbers, and overwhelm those who are trying to get you not to exercise your right, as the mothers in Oregon did. Was it Oregon? Yeah, they came out in large numbers and just makes it harder for authorities to use violence. So I think we're in a good time. I think this right is proving itself, not just in the US, but across the world. And I think you're seeing different countries are protesting. Belarus now is up. It's been up. They may not succeed because the response is bound to be very, very hard in Belarus. But I think it's great. And even if you don't succeed the first time, you just got to keep coming back at it, keep coming back. And this is all around the whole place. And what I really, really liking about these new protests is that it's so hard. It's almost, in fact, it is impossible to say these are the leaders. This 10, 15 people, and often men, are the leaders. You don't know who it is. I mean, it's going from city to place, and it just people are organizing in a very flat structure. That's absolutely wonderful. Some people don't like it. I know some of my friends who grew up in the Marxist tradition think that there must be a vanguard. There must be some level of control there. So I think it's interesting in that sense, where people are going to try and say that, look, let's have a more organized structure. But once you have a structure like that, then you lead to personality cults. You lead also sometimes easier to sabotage the movements, because just cut off people's heads and tails, you jail them, and it just loses its steam. So this is kind of interesting, when you can't tell where the head is or the tail is or the whatever it's at, and it happens because people are angry. And so it's just great to see that in a sense. So I'll leave it at that, so we can have a back and forth and have discussions. And so I'm sure you all have strong views and interesting comments and questions. So I'm happy to do that. But thank you all for coming. It's a big group. This is it's nice to see so many people keen on protests. It's nice. I hope you've all been protesting as well.
Maina, we've had a number of students protesting, and members of staff and faculty in the community for sure. While everyone's thinking of their questions, I just, it struck me you were talking about Wisconsin and Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times. And it was 6 years ago that Michael Brown was killed. And obviously you were there in Ferguson and in many cities in the US as UN Special Rapporteur, focused on Black Lives Matter and Indigenous rights, Standing Rock, and releasing reports during this time. I think you've also, while you were doing that work, looking at the ground up and how there were really interesting allies being formed and movements being formed. If you could share a little bit, maybe, what you saw in New Orleans or what you saw in some of the other cities that I think would be really interesting to students and others on the call, and even internationally. I remember you talking about South Korea and some of what you watched there. So over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, look, I think the world is learning that the best way to make a point and the best way to get solidarity is to converge the sectors that people are working on into together. And we really can't tell what the big issue will be. Sometimes it's climate change has happened, and people who are in civil rights come in, people in women's rights come on, people who are doing the labor rights should come on. But I think the big part of it is breaking the silos that have come up across people working in social justice. Let's call it just very broadly social justice. You had all these silos. Everybody's doing their own little thing, and they're very happy with doing it. Those who are doing litigation do litigation, and they're happy with it, and they're doing litigation in civil rights, and that's all they're going to do, and that's all they care about. I think what we're seeing is that effectiveness now, and because there has been such adaptation by those who want to keep repression going on. They've been so adaptive, and they've taken the tactics of the social justice people. Then it means social justice people have got to be 1 or 2 steps ahead, and that means doing things differently. It means collaborating. It means working with others across, working with labor, like it used to be. I mean, I think you have to go back and say and it's deliberate action and deliberate reach out that says we need to work with labor people and be prepared that when an issue that's important for labor is there, we'll turn up. When it's going to be with environmental people, when the climate change issues that are coming up arise, we will be there to come up. So all those things for me are critical, and so that bottom up and this is beyond the leaders of so-called sectors meeting up and having summits. And the old days was the leaders meeting and summiting and having great discussions and feeling very good about themselves. This really is grassroots on the ground where the issues are being affected, where people are being beaten, where there's cancer, the cancer alley in Louisiana, and where the Latinx community is being chased out, and you know, in Arizona, what was really impressive was seeing the Latinx, the so-called undocumented migrants, you know, coming out because they're angry with ICE, because what the authorities have done is they have linked up migration, policing all together, and so so if you come out to protest as an undocumented migrant, the chances of being deported rise, and so because they're working together. So why is it we don't work together? So what should we be doing to have barriers and protection, and with the way the mothers in Oregon did? How do we protect those people who are at bigger risk? So part of it as well, I think, it is the use of privilege for a good cause. And if you've got some of that, then use it. Whether it's white privilege, it is educational privilege, it is class. If it's a class one, you know, use it to protect those who will be more at risk than you are, and that means getting together. That means linking up together. That means knowing each other. That means understanding our core. Of course, it's harder to do that now since Corona, to meet up and build those good relations. And I think one of the things that's happened is that if you hadn't built up those relations, it becomes harder, because there's a lot of personal relationships that need trust. Doesn't just build over Zoom. I can assure you, we will do a lot of Zooms before trust happens. And we're trying to do that somewhere else. And we started Zooming in April, and we're still not built up enough trust. So it's just hard to build it up over Zoom. So maybe once this is done, we can be able to have face-to-face and be able to just have human conversations and interaction that can maybe help us to build those linkages. But there's nothing more important. I mean, I think, yes, I know some people always go and do lobbying and seek legislative change. My hope, really, when I look at this, is seeing the summer and seeing what's gone on in the last 5-6 years in the U.S. and how much energy young people have had. How can they? My question really to them is, I hope that they use this energy and this organizing and this collectivity that they have built to push, first of all, in the election, to make sure people vote. I think it's important that young people vote. I think more than anybody else, they just got to vote. We are not going to have the perfect candidate. That's the truth. The only perfect candidate in any election in the world is yourself. So when you decide to become the candidate, wherever you are, then it can be the perfect candidate. But nobody can ever match all our needs. That's the truth, and it's a hard one, but it's the truth. And so we have to dig deep and say, which candidate can give us more space to be able to do the things that we need to do. So I'm not even talking about a good candidate, where will you have the space to organize, to build up, to move it, to get to where you want to go? So I know it's hard, and of course, a lot of us had a lot of anxiety and heartaches when the nomination of the Democratic Party happened, because we thought that Joe was a bit too moderate, and these times call for strong, decisive action. But look, it's what we have. He'll for sure he will give more space than the current regime, and that's, for me, that's what's important. Where do you get space to be able to then organize better, to move the agenda forward? So no perfect candidate until Camille decides to run for president, and all of us will be happy that she is running for president. She's a perfect candidate, but it doesn't happen. It don't happen. So yeah, so I know it's hard, but that's one of the things. So we organize ourselves, get out the vote, get to vote, get the breathing space. That's what we need. We need the breathing space, because we've got to get that knee off our necks, and then we can organize and move the agendas forward. And once that's done, let's now begin to look at, okay, we've done that. How do we use this collectivity we've built up to make sure that we can get Biden to give us health care as a right? He has said he won't. We can make him. It can make him. He doesn't govern for himself. He governs for the country. So if you all can come out and keep it, who says he can't get there? These guys are all elected, so if they get enough, the pressure from the ground up, wherever they are, hey, they might be moving much more radical than he wants to go. So that's probably what you want. So keep this thing going, guys, and you're in a good place. Just don't let it go. You had this movement really in 2008 when Obama was getting elected, and somehow it fizzled out or dissipated in a way that wasn't. I'm not quite sure what happened, but it dissipated. But it's got to be kept together. And I think that for me, it's best during where you have space to push. Yes, you've got to keep pushing. There are no angels here. There's no angels. So let's go with that and try and get the space.
I think now what we'll do is take 3 questions. Let's first unmute Stephen Rosenfeld, and then we'll just move down the list. And Maina, I would be working on your campaign for something, but we do have our voting rights initiative going strong at the Sorensen Center. And so we'll be poll working, and we've been registering people. We're going to keep it up. So from our end. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, I had just an observation that it didn't seem to me to be a mere coincidence that a protester in Kenosha was shot by a counter demonstrator was coincided with the appearance at the Republican convention of that husband and wife who had brandished automatic weapons at Black Lives Matter marchers. That didn't seem to me to be just a coincidence. But I have a serious question for you, Maina. If there is a right, and of course there is a right to protest and to march and protest en masse, how is there a workable rule of law that balances that right with the right of everyone else to go about their legitimate affairs unimpeded? So, you say, well, police can just deny permits, and they often do, but is there a workable rule of law that can be applied across the board to balance those 2 interests?
Should I answer that, or should we wait for other questions?
Go ahead.
Okay, I think that's a good one, Stephen. I think it's the question about balancing of rights. Look, I mean, it's common, and actually the European Court of Human Rights has discussed that a few times about traffic. When protesters block traffic, what about the rights of people of the people in traffic? Generally, the rule is that, look, it's clear when people protest, there needs to be an expectation of disruption. Of disruption now. So especially if there are very many. So a lot of it is, you can't have a hard and fast rule and say that if there's 1,000 people, then they're allowed to block the road. You can't really have numbers on it. But generally speaking, the law seems to suggest that if your numbers are not enough to block the road, then you shouldn't block the road. You should be able to give space. So, but if your numbers are in the tens of thousands, then you do have the rights to block the road, block traffic, as long as you're doing it peacefully and without arms, if you wish. So this has been debated a lot, and actually a lot of a lot of countries, I've seen this raised a lot in the former Soviet countries about, but you're blocking traffic, you shouldn't block traffic. Go and, in fact, the former Soviet countries want you to go and march far away out in the fields where there's nobody else, which doesn't work, because they say, I guess one of the fundamentals of human rights law is that you need to be able to protest in sight and sound of the target, because you want the target to hear and see you. So those issues are, so it's one of, and it's a balance. I mean, look, there's no absolute right, and so it depends. So if you are few, then you give way. I mean, it's rational as well. But if you're tens and tens of thousands, then the public who are trying to use the roads or other things move, and they find an alternative route to get there, because this has not been, which is why, in fact, we argue that it's good for you to tell the authorities, to inform the authorities about the march, so that they can prepare to block streets and be prepared to do, but not for their permission, just for preparing. Now, the only time that also becomes important is if there's a counter demonstration, a counter protest by somebody else. And then at that point, the role of the authorities is to make sure that while both sides can see and hear each other, they are not allowed, they must keep a safe distance so it doesn't lead to violence and conflict. So you've got to keep a safe distance. So the police then play a role of making sure they're not in each other's faces. And so that's the time when they can come in all those, that gear and do it. But again, half the time, as I think there's a question in the chat, protesters react to the police. If the police come without their Ninja Turtle suits, then people are quite friendly and they're quite happy. The moment they come in Ninja Turtle suits, everybody's tensions are raised. So part of the things we worked on when I was the rapporteur was trying to work with the police to focus on de-escalation as opposed to escalation. How do you de-escalate? And de-escalation, even how you dress, can de-escalate or escalate, depending on so many things, and what weapons you have. And some police, I know the Metropolitan Police in London at that time anyway, were keeping their riot police far away. You couldn't see them. And the only police you could see were those who were in plain uniform, in uniforms without any batons or anything, just their hands and saying, please keep away, watch this. They were quite very polite. But 3 or 4 blocks, there were police ready to deal with anything that may arise. And that seemed to work because I think the psychology is that when there's a sense of a stand by the police, then people get agitated. Actually, they get nervous, to be honest. People get nervous and they get afraid, and then they lash out. And from then on, you begin to lose your focus. So it's just part of it is policing. And how do you train police to de-escalate? How do you train police to understand that beating up fellow people is not the way? Because I tell you, I mean, sometimes you see the clips of police in Belarus, to Turkey, to Sri Lanka, to Kenya, to Zimbabwe, to US, to the UK sometimes, and you think, my goodness, are these people trained by the same person? It just seems to be fascinating how there's that anger, and when they get on you and start beating you, there's so much anger, and I never understand what it is. So maybe it's how they select people to be in the police force as opposed to looking for people who might be de-escalating. I don't know. I mean, it's a question that's got to be. It's going to be one of those things that's going to be enduring over years and years and years in terms of discussing. But I think it's not. It's the conflict of rights will always arise. The conflict of the right to expression versus the right to privacy, for example, constantly arises, and you've got to figure out where a boundary is, a border is between the two. So rights do actually conflict, and you've got to find a balance. And then that's when now you have if you have good judges, and then it can work well.
And thinking about domestic courts and domestic decisions and laws and international law, I know Spain and some other countries have had the courts have ruled that the public space is not only for circulation, but it's for participation, which I love that concept. And I think that went in perhaps that thinking into the work that's been done in your tenure and post on freedom of assembly. But I think let's now turn, because there's a related question from Angelisa Gopi.
Hi. So my question is actually similar to one of the other questions. A lot of people do say that international law, it's important, it's persuasive, but it doesn't have any teeth. So I actually did do some research on this, and international law can be binding, but it's often not. So would making international law legally binding or self-executing be effective in ensuring the protection of human rights?
You know, that's and I think there's a question in the chat that's very similar about the I think it's from Shilpa, yeah, very similar about the non-binding nature of international law, or the non-enforceability of international law, which is, you know, it's binding, but it's binding. It's where it is binding, like when it's a convention, it's a treaty, that's binding. When it's general comment, that's persuasive, it's not binding. So there's a whole process that moves things up. When you get a treaty, and now it's kind of hard to get treaties because of the way the world is. It's hard to get the Chinese and the Americans to ever agree, and they both have a veto. So it's just moving it is just going to be hard for a long time to actually get new international law. But that said, there's the other way, which is that once principles, international human rights law principles, are used over and over again, then they start becoming binding. When courts start enforcing them and citing them and using them positively, as they do with the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission, Inter-American Court, then they start becoming seen as binding provisions of law. So that's how it works. The other question of enforceability is harder, because there's no police to enforce judgments. There's no police to enforce when a country has broken the law or companies broken the law. There's nothing more you can do. The most you can do is peer pressure, really, and it has a bit more. You know, sometimes because I have the same debate with myself. Why do we focus on the international level when, you know, if China refuses, it refuses. Yet when you issue a statement as a rapporteur on China, the reaction of China is incredible. They come at you, they want to talk to you, they want to discuss with you, they want you to reduce the severity of your comments because they think it's not fair to them. There's a level of shame, of pride that countries have got. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy, if you wish. So it's an interesting thing, and they come at you even before sometimes you produce. They just hear that there's a statement being worked on China or on Israel, and they come at you. They come and prepare and go at you so you do not publish it. They do not move it. So there's stigma, and that stigma sometimes is useful because it then makes some countries shift sometimes, but you know, they hate it. So you can see even a country like Myanmar, which is not a powerful country by any standards internationally, it's fought tooth and nail against the idea that what's happened to the Rohingya should be classified as a genocide. They even took out the nuclear weapon and sent Aung San Suu Kyi to the International Court of Justice, which is a clever way to, a clever tool used by the Gambia government to try and try at least raise this issue to come to that level. But they saw them. She came and trying to defend, using every ounce of a credibility left in her as a Nobel Peace Prize, as an icon of human rights and democracy, using every ounce of credibility to try and defend the country, and to try and avoid being labeled as a country that's doing genocide. So states use a lot of money. They use a lot of resources to try and avoid criticism and try and avoid being seen as a pariah state. And look, so yeah, those are some of the things that are there. Sometimes if you're a powerful state against a weaker state, US and Sudan, for example, then you can force Sudan to pay you money. Then once they pay you money, you're removed from lists and you can be able to move. So it's not necessarily the greatest way to seek accountability. But it's not perfect. I tell you, Angelis and Shilpa, it's not a perfect system. It's far from it. It's a persuasive system. It's a lot of arcane rules sometimes you have to work on. There's a lot of going back and forth and pushing and pushing and pushing. And to be honest, states are also getting very clever at it. They're hiring fantastic PR companies to fight back, to give a different option. They're using social media better than everybody knew before. So it's going to get it, and that influx of resources must tell us that there's something in it, that they don't want that tab. So it's not necessarily all weak. There's something in it.
Following up on Shilpa's question is Katie.
Hi, thank you so much, Camille and Sorensen and Maina. So I just have a follow-up on this question of accountability, and I understand that some international law is binding and some is persuasive, but at the same time, I still think that the international community could and should be pressured more to uphold these standards for violations. So what can we do? How can we pressure our own states? How can states pressure other states more? What can be done to actually go from the level of documentation, which we have much of these days, to real accountability? Thank you.
I think this is where this is where we say that if the international has to be localized, and I think that's where you say, now if you get a ruling or something happening at the international level that is positive as far as you're concerned or people are concerned, then how do you push that at the local level? That's really one of the strongest tools that rapporteurs have got. And just to give you a little example, when I did a mission to Korea in 2015, and one of my comments, one of my statements was that this idea of Korea doing blanket bans against protests because they're too close to the blue castle or blue house, I think is what it's called. Their White House is called Blue House. They didn't want them to be close. So they have done blanket bans. These areas are not allowed to protest in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I said this is illegal under international law and standards because you have to be in sight and sound. And the idea of a blanket ban is wrong. You need to do it case by case because they can't all be the same. And it's a report. I did my report and I left. And then a year later or 2 years later, some lawyer sees it and they've gone. There's been a blanket ban on a protest. They go to court and they cite this in the court saying, this is what the special rapporteur said. This is what international law says. Surely it's wrong to have a blanket ban. The court agreed with it. And that opened up, by the way, the 27 Saturdays of 1 million people protesting in Korea every Saturday that eventually led to the resignation of the president. It was unbelievable. Just a small little thing you think. And when you do that line, you just think, oh gosh, I'm just doing a sentence here. And it proves to have some impact. So, so I met these Koreans once. I was in Taiwan, and these Korean lawyers come to me and they come and hug me, and I had no idea who they are. I say, hey, this was pre-COVID, so you could hug those days. And I say, oh, thank you. And I said, what for? Why? And I say, oh no, your report. It was fascinating. It's very validating, to be honest. So from my part, as a person, it was very validating and made me feel that maybe there was some use to my time as rapporteur, because over 6 years, just like you are arguing, and you are asking Angelisa and Shilpa, you keep asking yourself, what was the purpose of all those 6 years of work? Did I, what was the impact of it? Did I touch somebody? And the small things you could see perhaps, but you always have to question yourself. Did I have any impact? Was this worth it? Because I put a lot of time and energy into being rapporteur, and you keep asking yourself whether it was worth it or not. And anyway, so those small stories help. They help us feel good with ourselves, which is probably why we like to protest so much, because since we can't change the government overnight, we just need to feel good with ourselves. Let's go and protest, let's get out there, as many of us as we can.
Well, thank you for all of the work that you've done. We're seeing some of the benefits and feeling some of the benefits of all you've done. So let's take 2 more questions. I think first, let's go to Jeremy Chan Krauscher, who's a Sorensen Center Fellow this year. And then let's come back with Anatoly for the last question.
There's also a question from Sally as well. It's in there, in the chat.
We'll get to Sally for sure. So we'll have to kind of keep the responses very brief. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And mine can be short because it's a kind of broad question, and it's similar to Stephen's earlier one around the intersections of different rights. And I was just wondering if you could provide just like a brief global overview around governments doing what the US has been doing for a very long time, which is restricting the right to protest, even what they did a few nights ago and last night in Wisconsin, around sort of saying private property or order is allowing governments to put curfews in effect or just limit people's right to protest, and wondering if the US right now is an outlier there, or whether or not that's also something that's been a popular move by governments, and how you might resist that. Thanks a lot.
Sally? do you want to go next? Let's just get 2 questions in, and then we'll hear from Maina before going to the final question. Okay, Maina, why don't you respond to that question?
It's a long question, actually. That's one of the questions you can't answer briefly because it's an overview, but it's not an outlier, to be honest. I mean, states use a lot of excuses to try and restrict assembly rights. So they will use private property, they will use the threat of violence, they will use the idea that there's conflicting rights, as I said, with traffic. So this fits into this kind of rationale is what I have seen actually in most of the authoritarian states. That's really what it fits. So it is one of the issues where the US becomes more like China and more like China than Sweden, and less like Sweden. So or less like Canada. So there are many countries you can point out which are much more open about it and which do it. So US is not doing well because actually it's being seen now more and more globally as actually between China, US, Russia, same, memchos, same difference.
So I'm here now. I unmuted myself. If I can ask a question. I was just wondering, what your take on the two-party system that exists in America is, because you seem to have, a very expansive knowledge of how governments work in different countries, and I don't necessarily think. I mean, I know how it works in the United States, but I don't necessarily think that it's right. And how do you expand that two-party system, or can we, in your opinion?
That's a good one. I mean, there's nothing, you can't legislate and say you must have 5 parties or you must have 10 parties. You just can't legislate that. All you can do is open up to as many parties as possible and let anybody who wants to form a party do it. Practically speaking, my personal view is that 2 parties are too few, and I grew up in a one-party state, totally just one party. We had no choice, and I don't like that. I don't like that idea that. So, but you try and live with it. You try and say, okay, we're in one-party state, so maybe we choose at the local level leaders who might respond to us, ignoring at the top because the presidency is already decided without us. We had no choice in the presidency, but at least at the local level, sometimes we did, and in fact, it unraveled when the president began interfering at our choice level, where we could choose and imposing his stooges to be our local leaders. So that then began unraveling. Anyway, 2-party system for me is a bit small. I think I would like to see much more choices. That means people deciding what they're going to do. But again, just my personal view, I think the only country that's got 2 parties like that is India now. Has basically got at the national level has 2 major parties. One is, in fact, it's almost a one-party state for those who might know India. It's basically now a one-party state with the BNP because the Congress party is suffering so much. But yeah, so that's the hassle with a 2-party system. If one of the parties begins to disintegrate, then you go quickly into a one-party state. It's very, very dangerous. So you need somebody else. And I know the UK used to have 2 parties, and they got a 3rd party. They are back to basically 2 parties now with some small fringe parties. Yeah, so I think it's up to individuals and up to the countries and the citizens themselves to work at it. So again, it's a good cause for people to work at. And I know for a fact, let me just say this last bit, I know for a fact that for those people, anybody who would want to create and move a new party, you need the political space to be able to do so. You need to be able to be organized, you need to be able to go around the country, you need to be free of fear and intimidation to be able to organize a 2nd, a 3rd, 4th, 5th party. So sometimes that's what you need, the space, and then you can work on it. It won't happen easily, but hey, it's an option.
Wonderful. So let's go over to Antoli to ask the last question. And if I could expand her question a little bit to also talk about social justice lawyers in training, given who we have on the call. So thank you for your question, Antoli.
Yes, specifically, I'll jump right into it. It's just basically geared towards grad students. So I'm a new grad student. I actually do currently work in social services. So I'm just trying to, I work amongst social workers, graduate level social workers. My case in particular, I'm trying to steer away from the clinical side of things in mental health, and I want to focus more on the basics of human rights, because I think, you know, we tend to browse over a lot of things and address it with a band-aid of mental health instead of trying to figure out the core issues that's going on in society. So how can me as a graduate student really get to the base of some kind of foundation from a cultural standpoint to really work collectively, birth new ideas, and try to build a new foundation that can launch avenues of volunteerism and just basically helping out in our community to say, hey, these are some of the rights that we're overlooking. Yes, mental health does matter, but before that, we need to address some of the things we're overseeing.
I've asked a question of that's about organizing in and of itself. How do you organize? And that's how do you get into the things that matter to a community? And how do you get communities to trust you that you can work on mental health, you can work on post-traumatic stress, which is a big thing. And I think sometimes we don't even understand that. And how do you work on history? For me, one of the big questions, not just here, but across the world is history lessons that make sense, that can give us, that can empower us. I mean, I was just talking to different people about the Tulsa massacre. How many people had ever heard of it before 5 years ago? Just we glossed over. People didn't know about the Black Wall Street until 5-6 years ago. So there's all that stuff that we don't know about history. And history is an empowerment thing. So mental health, mental health issues are about people feeling sometimes, not always, a lot of the times feeling powerless, feeling hopeless, feeling beaten down and just finished. And you've been, as we said, the state has just finished you. As we say, it has finished. So there's nothing left in you. So we have to find those things and how we organize around that with empathy, with compassion, and understanding what these things. I don't believe in organizing on the basis of law. I believe in organizing on the basis of justice and on rights. And then you can bring the law in afterwards. People understand. So if you're organizing on what people care about, and then you can talk about law, what if the law allows you to. So law must be seen as a tool, not as the reason for it. And I know a lot of lawyers hate me when I say that because it's because their reason that is the law. But I think law should be serving us rather than us serving the law. And I think that's something that if you can work on those at the basic level, what people need and what people care about, and how we explain things in ways that people understand and can be touched by. And I think that's part of, and to be honest, the thing as well for us is we've got to learn how the authoritarian and the other side has gotten itself so organized and so effective, because they are. I mean, maybe part of it is that for them, there's no line between truth and fiction, that's for sure. And that's something I think many people have, at least I have a difficulty with. I don't think the end justifies the means. So I think, but something we've got to figure out how they've been able so well to organize and be able to move so many people. And even if the far right in this country is 30%, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people, and it's it's huge, and that's scary in a sense. And it won't just go away, even if they lose. My question actually is more, my issue is whether if he leaves or not. And I remember telling Camille, I'm not so sure this man is going to leave. He's not going to leave. The way I see him, he's acting exact. I know this character. I know it. I've seen it up close. This is Museveni. I've seen them. This is Mugabe. They don't leave. They don't leave. And so it can't be close. If it's close, they will not leave. You'll just be tied up in knots and ups and downs. It's going to be overwhelming. I mean, this is not a guy who's going to leave. He's got too much to lose if he leaves. So whether he's going to go, he's got to be taken out kicking and screaming. It's got to be the only way. So you've got to get out, guys. I mean, if nothing else, if you hear nothing else from what I've said today, please just go get your young friends to vote. Just mobilize. That's the only thing I care about today. Nothing else. Because we all need some breathing space in the world. This American election is not just about Americans. It's also about the rest of us in the world, It's about us. So we need space. I'm not saying I am totally, besotted with a Biden ticket, but we need space to breathe, and that's what you guys have to give us. And you're the generation now that's holding the keys. It's not the Stevens and the Camilles have done their bit, and it's now your turn, guys. All of you who are young and fresh.
That's, I think if you get to know some of the students coming in and some of the students we have now, which we hope you'll do when you come back, you'll see there's that energy, there's that fire to do just what you described. So thank you, Maina. We hope that you'll be back soon to talk with us. You always share so much wisdom and also so much hope and joy. I mean, I remember in the winter, you would come in from Kenya and you would come into the blizzards and you'd come in with that big smile on your face, and you do this really tough work, but you show that you can do it and do it with joy and love, and we're grateful for you, especially in this time. So thank you again. Thank you all for joining. Follow the Sorensen Center for International Peace and Justice, and stay involved with what we're doing.